Hello, everybody. Welcome to our online Zoom event, How to Cope with the World in Turmoil, the Case for Global Cooperation with Jeffrey Sachs. We're very pleased to have virtually with us tonight at the FCC. I'm Jody Schneider. I'm the president of the FCC and senior international editor of Bloomberg News based here in Hong Kong. I'm going to give a brief introduction of our speaker, and then we will start asking questions. This is being streamed live, and it will be on video, which we will post tomorrow. And we welcome your questions. So please ask and continue to ask throughout the event here. We would ask that when you ask a question, if you could give your name and affiliation, please. So to kick off the event, I just wanted to say a few words about the topic. The world currently is in the midst of 4 significant disruptions: the pandemic, as we all know, the turmoil of US foreign policy, especially regarding China, the rapid move to a digital economy, and the massive disruption of the natural environment. On the environmental stage, this includes not only climate change, but the collapse of biodiversity and growing pollution, especially in urban areas. These challenges require global cooperation, but rather than advancing, our speaker says that our speaker, a noted economist, global thinker, and best-selling author, is going to discuss his ideas on how global politics can be reoriented from the current dangerous and destructive path toward cooperation and problem solving. Jeffrey Sachs is someone who, to many of you, needs no introduction, but I'll give a short one. He is a professor and director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University in New York, where he directed the Earth Institute from 2002 until 2016. He's also director of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network and has been an advisor to 3 United Nations Secretaries General. He currently serves as the Sustainable Development Solutions Advocate under the current Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He's a best-selling author, was twice listed as one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential world leaders, and was ranked by The Economist among the top 3 most influential living economists. We're very honored to have him with us here at the FCC. My first question, I'm going to just start with the title, Coping with the World in Turmoil. And that's certainly the case right now. It seems like every day there is more turmoil. The virus is spreading, even here in Hong Kong, where we had dealt with it pretty well. We are now in what some are calling a 3rd wave, and it's back as somewhat of almost a cautionary tale. The US-China tensions are now spilling over into Australia, Canada, and today, more the UK. Economies around the world are more and more dire. How is it possible to even think about global cooperation right now?
Thank you very much. Good evening to everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to exchange some views and hear some questions, and I hope gain ideas from each other. Well, in the US, we're trying to survive 6 months more of Trump because I would put a lot of responsibility of this crisis on his complete failed presidency. So if Trump is reelected in November, I have no answer for you. I think the world will spiral out of control. If Trump is defeated, as seems likely, we have the chance to have a rational president, and then I think we could start to sort out lots of things. So while it may be a little bit of a parochial view, I think that the US is really going to determine a great deal of what happens ahead. Inside the United States, we are absolutely in chaos. The epidemic itself is raging. There are more than 70,000 cases every day, 1,000 deaths or more every day, some not counted. We count about 1,000 deaths per day. It's spread around the country. The country is completely polarized, like the likes of which has not occurred, I'd say, since the US Civil War. Trump is deploying secret unmarked troops to American cities. We're in a truly extraordinary situation. And I believe that this has spilled over into international politics. A lot of the escalation of rhetoric and actions vis-a-vis China are really about a combination of Trump's domestic politics and his dangerous view of the world. So my quick answer is we can't have cooperation with Trump as president. We won't. He's too mentally unstable. But we do have an election coming up and a prospect of his losing power. Whether he accepts it or not is another matter. It's a drama we've never heard before. President of the United States saying in an interview over the weekend that we'll have to see whether he accepts the results of the election. It is a kind of psychopathology. He's mentally ill, in my opinion, and very dangerous.
So in your view, this is sort of right now a pause situation. And I wonder, I mean, I know many of us sort of feel that way, even living elsewhere where we're, you know, not in the US and not under a presidency like this, that given the pandemic and given all that's happening between countries and given that you can't really go anywhere, it feels like we're all sort of pausing. Do you feel that way about foreign policy to some degree and perhaps domestic policy in various governments, including in China?
I think a pause would be the best possible outcome right now, because I don't think that there's any business to be done with this administration at the end of the four-year term in any event, but with its profound instability in any case. Clearly, there's a lot of complete improvisation underway. There can be no deal making, it seems to me. Even the much vaunted trade deal is so unstable and so perverse and followed by so many other US unilateral attacks on China. For example, on the semiconductors and of course the unrelenting attacks on Huawei and so forth, that I don't see there being any business right now other than of the most tactical kind to keep Trump amused and distracted perhaps long enough to get to something better. Again, if there are many accidents that could happen in the United States, there really could be mass civil unrest. Trump could flagrantly reject an election outcome, and he has plenty of supporters, though not a majority of the American people. These may sound like crazy scenarios, and indeed they do sound to me like crazy scenarios, except for the fact that the president is crazy. So in that sense, we're in a very unpredictable mode. I would say to other countries, don't get provoked. This is obviously a time when Trump is looking to provoke. A crisis is his friend in his mind. Anything that it becomes more unstable, any escalation of international tensions, he must think plays to reshuffling the deck right now that is not on in his favor. He's down double digits in the election polls. Much of the public is literally sick of him because we're sick of COVID, and he has had no response. So pausing, waiting is absolutely the best strategy if it can be pulled off. It seems that this is what Chancellor Merkel did when she said we should postpone the G7 meeting from June to September. I'm hoping that she will now say perhaps it's not really timely to have a G7 meeting in September, given the imminence of the elections and so much else, and will continue to postpone. And this, I think, would be the smart strategy anywhere.
Well, talk to us about the pandemic. I mean, you've talked a little bit about this and the lack of federal response in the U.S., but your views on it. Obviously, health is one of the fields in which you are expert. It's clearly worsening around the globe, coming into second and third waves here in Asia, clearly out of control in the U.S. From your economic and UN experience, what can and should be done? I mean, if you could, we can't wave a wand and go back to January when we started dealing with this here in Hong Kong and in Asia. But what can we do so that this is not, it's a bad enough experience, but it doesn't become something nightmarish out of a dystopian novel, or as Dr. Fauci says, perhaps as bad as the 1918 flu pandemic. If you could wave your wand and get everybody on the same page or on various pages, what would you do now as an economist and somebody who has thought a lot about health and these kinds of issues?
Well, I think the goal for the world is to do as well as Hong Kong, to put it quite simply. Hong Kong does not have it 100% suppressed, but compared to the United States, both the cases and the deaths are roughly 100th or less in order of magnitude. And when there are outbreaks, they are brought under control. There's a public health system. And it's not obvious that this would be the case because Hong Kong is next to China. It was direct in line after the Wuhan outbreak. Hong Kong is packed to the gills. It is one of the most densely settled places on the planet. One could have imagined that it would be a terrible outcome. And I think the experience of SARS clearly was the warning shot that enabled Hong Kong, Taiwan, and much of the rest of the Asia Pacific to sit up, take note, and say, this is the real deal as soon as the news started coming out of Wuhan. And the response in general in the Asia Pacific is vastly superior to not only the United States, by the way, but also to the whole North Atlantic region, both Western Europe and North America and now South America, which is also a disaster. So we see several points about this pandemic, which are clear. This is a very tricky virus because there is a considerable amount of asymptomatic and pre-symptomatic transmission. There is not a long warning period of sickness as there was in SARS before transmission can take place, quite the opposite. And so this virus can spread with a doubling time of a few days for weeks in a rather stealthy way, which is what happened in the US in February and March. It happened all through Western Europe, in France, Italy, Spain, UK, Germany. There was a lot of arrogance in Western Europe and the US, thinking this isn't about us, this is about China. We have it under control. And in fact, it was handled with utter incompetence and disdain. Borders remained open. Traffic through the airports remained open. In the United States, we had a complete failure, as you know, of testing equipment. Our Centers for Disease Control completely failed. But I can say that what is happening now is even more than what was happening in March and April, a measure of policy leadership at this stage. Because many countries that had a rampant pandemic, say in Western Europe, at least took actions that were sensible. And while they did quite badly in March, April, and May, they began to get the virus at least partly under control by June and now July. Whereas in the United States, Trump, because he is a mentally ill man, because he is utterly incompetent, because everything is viewed through the lens of how does this look on the daily news, basically was unwilling from the start and incapable from the start of having a rational response. We live in a country that suppresses science, suppresses scientists. The federal government has attacked its scientists for years under Trump. The White House task force, so-called, is a farce and is worse than useless, because it looks like there's actually a task force when in fact there's no federal policy at all. And so the reality in the United States is that everything has been left to the state and local governments. That's like teaching 50 governors about basic public health in the middle of an epidemic and teaching thousands of mayors about basic epidemiology, and trying to tell hundreds of millions of unruly Americans to wear face masks because Americans are unruly. They don't listen. Their manners are very bad. The etiquette is very bad. A lot of Americans carry guns and think that that is a source of their pride. And the result of all of this is that our country was completely incapable of addressing this epidemic, because you don't arrive months after the start of this with 70,000 cases a day now, and more than well, we don't know how many deaths, but recorded about 1,000 deaths per day. Now, the fact of the matter is this has taken over all of the Americas, with the partial exception of Canada. But Mexico is also ruled by a populist. Brazil is ruled by somebody who is as crazy as Trump, unfortunately, Bolsonaro. And he left Brazil completely exposed to a full-fledged, rampant pandemic, which, of course, in the past week infected him as well as much of his entourage. But tens of thousands of people dying in Brazil. And it's true all over the Americas. Now it's spreading out of control in many parts of Africa, in many parts of India. And with the US being a rogue nation, in effect, hostile to the World Health Organization, pulling support from the World Health Organization, incapable of internal action, hostile to global cooperation, we don't have the kind of organized global response that is absolutely vital for suppressing this. So we have basically a few pockets of the world, one fairly large part of the world, that is China and most of the Asia Pacific, roughly about 2 billion people, where I would say the virus is not, of course, perfectly suppressed or eliminated, but is controllable and is being controlled. Then we have the Americas, which is completely out of control, Africa losing its grip, India seeming to be losing its grip, Europe divided. It's coming under control in much of Europe. In Central and Eastern Europe, interestingly, it has been kept under control, whereas in Western Europe, it's only now getting under control. And in Russia and Central Asia, it seems to be surging. So the world is quite varied, non-cooperative, and experiencing, therefore, a pandemic in a manner so disorganized and so tragically worse than it should be. Because I go back to where I started, this is a controllable virus, though not an easy virus to contain. Hong Kong's experience and the experience of the neighbors, notably Taiwan, Japan, Korea, New Zealand, Vietnam, Lao PDR, Cambodia. There are many countries that have suppressed the virus. And that shows that it can be done and it should be done. But again, without cooperation, leadership, know-how, it has not been done. A final point that I think is notable about this is that the more unequal are the societies, as in the United States and Brazil, the worse has been the epidemic, because rich people protect themselves, poor people suffer, and society does not unify to get a shared response.
Well, thank you on that. So I wanted to go to that inequality issue. You famously wrote in your 2005 book, The End of Poverty, that Africa's governance is poor because Africa is poor. And you highlighted the role in Africa that geography and climate played in making Africa poor because it was landlocked and disease prone. Yet you wrote that these problems could be overcome with the right policies and investments. And tell us about that, and how today, when we come out of this and poverty and inequality will likely, those gaps will likely be widened after the pandemic. What does that tell us? And what, you know, there's no easy solutions here, but will there be solutions, or will we be left with a world of rising inequality?
I've always believed, as I wrote in the 2005 book, that these issues of fighting poverty, fighting disease, fighting climate change are truly global issues that require global cooperation. And of course, so we never have that global cooperation on an adequate level. So during the Millennium Development Goals, which was the period from 2000 to 2015, and now during the period of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, we have actually bold objectives in the case of the Sustainable Development Goals to end extreme poverty by the year 2030, which is SDG number 1. But we have lacked the global will to do it. I've argued repeatedly during this period from 2005 onward, indeed beforehand, that it's feasible to do, because if you look at the steps that would be needed to implement a public health system or a school system, or to fight poverty, or to provide social protection, the costs are really small, and the wealth in the world is really great. But the wealthy don't like to share their wealth. And so pointing out that the wealth in the world is really great is hardly sufficient to ensure that the poor even have the most basics available. The pandemic has widened these income inequalities and wealth inequalities dramatically. We're probably seeing the most extraordinary shift of wealth distribution in history during these months, though the dust has not settled. But in the US, just as an example, the stock market has increased during this epidemic, even as tens of millions of Americans have lost their jobs and their livelihoods. This is unlike the Great Depression, where there was mass unemployment and a falling stock market. But now the stock market is rising for several reasons, one of which is the massive shift of economic activity online, and therefore rewarding companies like Amazon or Apple or Google or Microsoft, all of which have seen rising shares, and therefore extraordinary increases of wealth of the world's richest people. Jeffrey Bezos has a net worth now of about $190 billion individually, at a time when tens of millions of people are basically facing starvation conditions, desperate inability to get even the basic foodstuffs that they need to stay alive. That's how twisted our world is. In that regard, it's notable that when Europe moved to tax the digital industry, because that's where all the money is, that's where the revenues and the economy is, the Trump administration threatened Europe with retaliation against French and German products if they would go ahead with taxing these companies, even on the activity of those companies in Europe. This is the kind of plutocracy that we have in the United States now. Trump gets large campaign contributions from billionaires. In return, he promises no taxation and deploys the power and threats of the US to stop the taxation of the rich. So all of this is to say that we're in the midst of a massive, massive crisis of rising inequality on top of all the other dimensions of this crisis, with massive job loss on the one side and the shift to online activity on the other side. Now, I like online activity in general, so I'm not against the technology by any means, but I am in favor of helping people who are in a desperate situation as a result of economic shifts far beyond individual control. That's the situation we're in. We need global cooperation and we need global development financing, which means whether it's taxes or transfers or development aid flowing from the rich to the poor so that the poor can get, stay alive and have a foothold in development. Let me just make two final points about this. One is that in general, the digital world net will be a benefit for the poor because a digital world allows for telemedicine, for online education, for e-governance, for e-payments, for e-banking, in other words, for access, if we focus on achieving such objectives. Second, I'm personally a big believer that China can and should play a major role in investing in and helping the poorer countries to develop. Many people attack China's role in Africa. I view it in the opposite way, that China's helping Africa to build infrastructure and so on, partly commercial, partly for diplomatic reasons, is not only appropriate, but is beneficial for Africa's escape from poverty.
We have a couple questions. This one, well, actually two. I'm going to do them in both of her questions. Jessica Park, who's an associate FCC member who's in the UK right now. She's saying there are more deaths per capita in the UK than in the US. Shouldn't you be blaming the Prime Minister there as well as Donald Trump?
Well, absolutely. Boris Johnson is also, in my view, irresponsible on many, many levels and did a terrible job in this pandemic, also contracted the disease in a very serious episode as well. But there's nothing impressive about Boris Johnson's administration. He and Trump are two of a kind, although I think that Trump is much worse in mental instability. Boris Johnson strikes me as irresponsible, and whereas Trump is psychopathic in my view. But Johnson obviously has done a terrible job in this pandemic, and Britain has suffered terribly from it. But it is, in a way, I think Johnson's done a terrible job on many different levels, and this is a part of it. It's a kind of failed politics, a populism that has no end other than the glorification of the politicians, and that ends badly.
Now I'll ask Jessica's other question, which is about China. She asked, do you put any blame on China for allowing many of its citizens to travel internationally while at the same time unable to travel within China when the epidemic first occurred, starting in January?
Well, I think that at the beginning, China made serious mistakes For example, there was a large public banquet in Wuhan to celebrate the new year on January 18, I believe was the date, which was clearly a major super spreader event. But I think that from China's lockdown in Wuhan on the 23rd of January, the world at least was put on dramatic alert that what was happening in China was extraordinary. And the virus, of course, was declared a public health emergency on January 30th. And so while in the fog of war in the first weeks of this pandemic, obviously mistakes and bad mistakes were made. I think that 2 points are clear. First, countries that had their eyes and ears opened and knew the experience of SARS were aware of the risks. And of course, Hong Kong, Taiwan, very much so, knew from the start, even before the lockdown in January 23rd, that something terrible was happening in China and one needed to take extreme precautions. The United States did not know those things. So the experience of Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea, countries that know China, that are that knew SARS, that were on alert, knew what to do, and took actions, whereas the United States did not. So I think that surely this could have been handled better, possibly much better, but in the beginning of an emerging disease, it's hard to get everything right. But what I do think is that by the time February came along, countries really had a lot of notice that this was a major, highly transmissible killer, and that extreme precaution should have been made. Even after Trump ordered, quote unquote, the closure of transport with China on January 30th, it's estimated that 40,000 people came into the United States with almost no monitoring at all. That is a US failure, fundamentally. And it's a shame, but it's a reflection of how lax and incompetent the US response is. But then I would go on. Even if one excused February, by the time March came around, the ICUs were packed to the brim. Then we knew we were in a global catastrophe. Lockdowns were coming. So in March, the forecast was made with the US having, I think at the time, around 3,000 deaths, that the deaths would reach 100,000. I wrote an op-ed saying that's impossible because of course we're going to take actions. There's no reason to be fatalistic about this. We'll get this under control. This won't reach 100,000 because that would be insanity for a controllable disease. I did not factor adequately for the insanity of a president, but we have reached 140,000 deaths now and still have no national policy. So I think that one can look at the early weeks and there's blame to go around. But I would say from February or March, countries had every reason for action. Some did act, many others did not. And the implications are now being felt in this extraordinarily differentiated response globally.
Thank you. Well, we have a question from Josh Zimmerman, who says, this is a little bit moving beyond the pandemic for the moment. He says, over the past 50 years, hasn't economic growth done more than anything else to reduce global poverty? And unfashionable, he says, these days, but doesn't that suggest we should generally push for less regulation and taxation and let growth help lift people out of poverty?
The thing that has made economic growth work is the availability of technologies to raise productivity and spread well-being. In that context, countries that have been successful in deploying technologies and integrating into the global economy have succeeded. That, of course, is China's approach since 1978. And that is to use this large amount of untapped technology in starting from conditions of a rural, basically peasant society in 1978 to have the most unprecedented rise of economic productivity in history. You can say that's economic growth, but I would not say exactly that it's the absence of regulation. I would say that it is targeted investments in building infrastructure, in investing in education levels, in managing the demographic transition, in engaging in international supply chains. And that's a recipe for catching up growth. The role of regulation is quite a different matter. If one thinks that China had to experience all of the pollution it did in order to achieve what it did, I would disagree with that. And similarly, if one wanted to argue that the only way forward for, quote, economic growth or ending poverty is mega pollution, I would also disagree with that because I think it's simply not the case. In other words, the case for regulation is a different kind of case. It's not about growth or not growth. It's about what kind of economic activities are favored or disallowed. And the ones that should be disallowed are economic activities, even if they're profitable in the marketplace, that create huge social damages. And now we know that those include reliance on fossil fuels, for example, because they're going to destroy the planet environmentally. So it's not a matter of regulation. It is true that giving incentives for profitable investment is a good thing. I favor a market economy, but I don't favor a market economy that destroys the natural environment. I don't favor a market economy that leaves people to starve to death because for whatever reason they're disabled or unable to find suitable employment or don't have the skills. In other words, I believe that one can have a market economy, environmental sustainability, and meeting basic economic needs all together. And that is almost the textbook definition of sustainable development. Economic development that is socially inclusive and environmentally sustainable. And that means having appropriate regulations and public policies along with the market incentives. That's the combination that I favor.
Thank you. Well, we have a couple political questions for you now. You can put on your political thinker hat. One is from Eric Wishart, who's our first vice president of the FCC and an editor at AFP. And he asked, how concerned are you? You had mentioned this in the beginning of this, that how concerned are you that President Trump, what he could do in his final weeks in office if he loses before Joe Biden, if he won, was inaugurated, and what about accepting the election result? Have you thought of any nightmare scenarios?
I think any sentient American these days thinks of nightmare scenarios because the president, the president invites us to. He was asked over the weekend in an interview with Chris Wallace, would he accept the election results? And of course, he ostentatiously said, we'll see. And he was pressed and he said, we'll see. So he's playing with this also. Playing or absolutely able to improvise as events unfold. He is mentally ill. And for me, therefore, a little bit hard to predict, though when I speak to forensic psychiatrists about Trump's personality, they tell me that as he gets increasingly cornered, perhaps losing the election or about to face a massive defeat, given his kind of psychopathology, he is absolutely capable of lashing out in a serious way. I think that this is real. It could be international lashing out. It could be a diplomatic crisis. It could be an escalation of threats of war. It could be a domestic crisis, calling troops into American cities, because he's even begun to do that. It could be flagrantly denying the election results, claiming massive fraud, and in his psychopathology, he may well believe it also. It could be well more than tactics. So this has been a difficult point all along, because it's perhaps natural for the media to think of Trump as obviously as a divisive and as a fighter and as a kind of alley fighter ready to use unsavory tactics. But it's harder in general to treat him as mentally ill or mentally disordered. And in general, journalists have refrained from doing that. Editors have refrained from featuring psychologists making such statements. The #1 bestseller in the United States right now, of course, is Mary Trump's book, his niece's book. She's a claimed, she is a PhD in clinical psychology, and the whole book is about how Trump is mentally disordered. Perhaps this will open up the discussion more than it has before. But I think one has to take this seriously, especially if we view it not as perhaps you and I would on normal political fighting, but from the perspective of a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist who looks at Trump's megalomania, paranoia, and other disordered traits, a lack of empathy, and takes them for what they are from a clinical point of view. So I think the chances of instability are very real. I'm very sorry to say.
Oh, I have a follow-up to that question myself. Having been an editor for many years in Washington, D.C. before I was in Asia, I still tend to trust the other branches of government, that the Supreme Court would not allow this to happen, that Congress, that the Joint Chiefs would step in. You're obviously closer to it than we are here. What is your sense of that? Do you have a sense that this would not be allowed to happen, that other branches would step in?
Well, all of our governance in the last 3 years, with basically one exception, which was the tax cut, which was passed by Congress, almost everything in the Trump administration has been by executive order or emergency decree. There's almost no legislation that takes place. In American law, there are many, many places, in fact, a shocking number of places, where the word emergency is available, and almost everything Trump has done on trade policy, on international policy, on sanctions policies, is under the rubric of emergencies. So in the first instance, Trump, surrounded by a gang that is not restraining him, uses these emergency measures. In this sense, Congress is not engaged actively in it. And up until now, as everybody knows, the Republicans in the Senate have tied their fate to Trump, given Trump's powerful appeal to the base of the Republican Party. And as a result of that, the Senate has provided zero restraint, but zero. The House of Representatives by itself, democratically led, can do nothing. And so Congress is really sidelined in this. Trump makes orders. These are executive orders. Then there are two areas that you mentioned that are very real. One is the courts. Typically, these orders are struck down by the courts, but that often takes weeks or months. Judicial processes are extremely slow, whereas executive action is by the minute. And we have relied on the courts to countermand Trump's personalistic rule. But while it has worked to a large extent, it's a very slow and laborious process. It's not up to an immediate crisis in most cases. Then comes the military. This is such a horrible consideration, but it is really possible for Trump, apparently possible, according to, I think, close observers, for Trump to foment an international crisis. The military is based on a chain of command. And the question is how that chain of command would function when an order is given by the commander-in-chief. It's a terrifying question, but it is one that anybody has to ask at this point. There have been statements made in recent months that the military command would not honor an unconstitutional order. What this means exactly and what it implies for an actual crisis is very hard to say. I think there's another broader question, which is would, if worse came to worse, and the president flagrantly rejects an overwhelming election defeat, for example, Americans have public outlets, people would pour into the streets. There would be obviously a huge, overwhelming uproar in the United States. Would our institutions respond to the public at that point? I would think yes, but all of this is to say, and maybe all of it is exaggerated. Maybe Trump will lose an election and leave. God forbid he should win an election from my point of view, because then everything I'm saying has no chance of being fulfilled. I just would see global instability of the worst sort. But if he does lose and the worst comes to worse, the point is we've not seen this kind of experience in the United States since 1861.
Yeah, but moving away from politics slightly, we have a question from John Dawson, who's a club member, who asks, how long can the total disconnection go on between the financial markets and the real economy? And what, in your view, would signify the crunch moment when the markets wake up to the reality of a global economy in deep recession?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think that there are several things reflected in the stock market valuation right now. One is that, of course, the stock market does not reflect the whole economy. It's not even designed to. It reflects the corporate economy with a disproportionate weight given to the online digital sector. So what we're seeing when we look at the indexes is indeed what's happening to tech much more than what's happening to the economy as a whole. We've lost employment of 20 million or so in the restaurants and the shops and the office support work, but that doesn't show up in the stock market. So part of what we're seeing is the online economy surging. A second part of what we're seeing right now is the advantage of having the Federal Reserve at your back. So the Federal Reserve has extended at least $3 trillion of credit and can extend more. And a lot of that shows up in the stock market. It even shows up in emerging market bonds and other very risky assets. It even shows up in cryptocurrency prices and a lot of other bizarre areas. So the economy has been pumped with liquidity, and that's a second dimension. But the third one, I think, is what the questioner is also asking correctly. I think that on average, stock market opinion has not understood the depths of the pandemic and the failure of the American response. I said in March, and then again in April especially, and with rising fervor in May, we're in a depression. And much of the normal market reaction was, no, we're in a V-shaped recovery. But the difference was I was watching the virus and they were watching the happy news of Trump's press conferences. The fact of the matter is the virus, quote, came back not as a surprise. It never left in the United States. So everything that's happening in the US right now was predicted and predictable. And it did take the shine off of this stock market boom, but it hasn't really caused a deep revaluation. I think that that is possible. We should add, by the way, for completeness of discussion, the fact that it is possible that a vaccine comes along soon and changes the tenor of all of the discussion. That's not out of the question. I don't think it's more than 50%. I'd say maybe 20%. There are many reasons why even the dozens of vaccines in trial may fail. There are many biological reasons, many vaccine development reasons, many unknowns in vaccine development, but it is not a small chance or not a negligible chance that we have a brighter prospect because of a successful vaccine that can be mass produced. That would still mean a year or more from now, certainly at the best, before mass production made a huge change in the dynamics of the pandemic, but it would change the outlook down the road. I don't think either we should rely on it. That's probably obvious. I don't think we should count on it from a probabilistic point of view for a lot of reasons, but the general one is that vaccines usually take more time to develop, and this is obviously a complex and evolving virus, mutating virus. And so the chance that on the first try, one gets a decisive breakthrough is still more long shot than not.
And I have several questions on the US and China, but I'm going to ask one because we don't have much time left. I'm going to ask the one from Alejandro Reyes at the Asia Global Institute of the University of Hong Kong. And he asks, assuming that Joe Biden wins, what do you think he would or should do in the first 100 days of his administration with regard to the pandemic, China, trade, and climate change? I don't know if Joe Biden is listening tonight, but
well,
will you give him some free advice here?
I'm sure he's listening in. Hello, Mr. Vice President. I think U.S.-China relations are so vital for the world that it is extremely important to set in place a thorough, high-level and extensive and serious interaction between the two countries. That is not a meeting of two leaders for an hour. That is not yelling from a press conference, making threats, pointing fingers. It's actually a deeply institutionalized process. The United States and China have to work out a lot of different questions. First, on cooperation to help the world to control this pandemic, to work out a modus vivendi on trade and investment issues, and to work out a strategy on climate change and other global public goods issues. All of that process has collapsed in the last 3 years because Trump does not believe in global cooperation. Everything has been unilateral from the start. Now, unfortunately, the anti-China sentiment in the United States is bipartisan. It's not as unstable as it is with Trump because of Trump's personal instability, but it is bipartisan. And so Biden will probably come in with a lot of people shouting at him, or maybe even his own campaign, that he's there to get tough with China. This is not unknown in American politics, to lead from the right and to lead from aiming to be tough. This is not what we need right now. What we need is serious discussion at a high level without unilateral actions and without unilateral threats right now. Between the US and China, the world is at stake, and avoiding a kind of Cold War or further deterioration of relations, as is occurring right now, is of the highest importance. And the issues at stake are complicated issues. And so I don't believe that this can be done overnight. And I would like to see, therefore, created a high-level working group process on both sides across many, many different issues, with the determination to bring the boil down to a simmer, to stop the unilateralism, to stop the threats, to stop the name calling, but to find practical solutions.
Well, I'm going to ask the last question. I'm going to take the questioner's prerogative and ask the last question. We could go on for a long time, and we have other questions, but value your time. So I want to ask, we're sitting in a press club, what I believe, and many of us believe, is the world's finest press club. How do you think the press has? Yeah, it is. You know, we're not being objective, but that's okay. But how do you think the press has done in covering the pandemic and in covering, you know, this part of President Trump's presidency? I want to ask you to grade the first, you know, the 3 years, but say the 6 months. And it's obviously a hard, tough job. Besides trying to bring facts to people, and he is the president of the United States, you have to cover him. But how do you think the press has done in this? And, you know, put your media critic hat on.
It's a very good question. And of course, I'm probably reading mostly the US and UK press predominantly. So I start out the day with the Post, the Times, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal as the first 4 papers I read, and Reuters just to get the news service clips. And I think the answer is okay, but not really keeping up with the weirdness of Trump. And what I mean by that is, on a typical day, the news story in the New York Times or Washington Post is, he lied again. And so every day, he lied. Every day, oh, look what Trump did, as if it's a surprise. And so there, and maybe that's how news is covered because it's news. That's what happened the day before. I don't read those stories anymore because they're kind of, to me, like, well, duh, I don't have time to read again that he lied. We need to understand the dynamics of what's happening. And if you, the reporter or the editor, is shocked each day, you shouldn't be any more shocked. We should be beyond that. I would like to see the press asking more the kinds of questions we discussed, which is what do we do when the following happens? How do we handle the instability of a leader? These are very tough questions for the press, obviously. I've written op-eds where I've said the president is mentally disordered or mentally unstable, citing professionals in the area, and the editors almost invariably take it out, as a part of the negotiation of publishing an op-ed. They say, well, we don't really want to say those things. We don't know. You're not a clinical psychologist, which I'm not, obviously, but I am citing them. And there's a certain sense, therefore, for me, of Groundhog's Day movie that we replay the script every day. And each day goes by and the craziness of it is shown again, but that's not really news. That's just replaying. And in that sense, I don't really know what to say about how better to do it, but it is a very unsatisfying aspect of the media. We are now in late July, we're July 20th, and the epidemic has been raging for months without any national policy. That's by itself a bizarre phenomenon that you could have a known massive crisis discussed every day in dozens or hundreds or thousands of articles and still no resolution to an actual strategy, for example, to how to fight it. And exactly what the role of the media is in that is obviously an open question, but I don't think the media in the United States, the lead media, have somehow drilled into the perversity of that fact in an adequate way, maybe other than repeating it each day, but not really helping us move beyond it. Creative journalism might be, here's a national plan, or how does one work around a crazy president, or other kinds of stories that would be responsive to the bizarre realities that we're living in. So also, I think I should add on the US-China relations, I'm not happy about the media coverage in the US. The stories are fed, to my view, overwhelmingly by the State Department or even by the intelligence agencies and others. Lots of rumor mongering, lots of one-sided view. And so even responsible press, which I would call the Post and the Times, they're not yellow press in any way, but they're not very good at moving beyond official rhetoric and stories to understand the kind of manipulated piece of this process by as a US strategy and the tactics of the US in the China bashing or trying to understand the Huawei story better and so on. So to my mind, that's a different kind of issue. That's an ongoing issue that the press has its sources in government. If the government is as bad as it is in the United States right now, or with this administration, that's often what gets represented in the news as well. Even if the newspaper is hostile in an editorial page sense to the administration, the news stories about foreign policy, in my view, tend only to skim the surface on these issues, and therefore leave unexposed some of the deeper reasons for the crises and conflicts that we're seeing. But having said all of that, I, like every other citizen, relies utterly on the press and on the media. So I'm not here to bash it. Quite the contrary. As I said, I start out reading 4 newspapers in the morning for a reason. And that's where I get my information to start the day. And I want to thank the correspondents for providing that.
Well, thank you. We wanted to thank you very much for spending this time with us, and we hope to welcome you once people can travel again to visit us and to address us here in the club. We would very much like that. So thank you again, Jeffrey Sachs, and thank you for everybody for your really good questions. Good night.
Thank you.